Thank you, everybody, for participating today. And I thank everybody for staying right now. I know it's difficult to sit all afternoon, especially this time of day. So thank you for giving me your patience and your time to allow me to say a few words to all of you. Thank you, Rabbi Hamanoff, for those beautiful, inspiring words and the inspiration to keep on learning and growing in Torah. I'm going to speak now about a topic which I think is very important to speak about on Tisha BAv, and it's about the Holocaust. We read this morning in one of the keynotes that at the time of the Crusades in 1096, there were tremendous tragedies. In Germany, we know Jews were massacred. Jews have been suffering throughout Jewish history. And there's always a question, maybe we should have a special holiday to commemorate each tragedy. And this even occurred after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. The question came to the Brisker Rav that maybe we should have a special day. We have something this week called Yom HaShoah. But in reality, there was opposition to it. And the reason is because we have a day. The day to commemorate, the day to delve into Jewish tragedy is Tisha BAv. And the reason is because Jewish tragedy all emanates from the same source. It emanates from the destruction of the temple. It emanates the two main problems that existed. One problem was sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which we still have not yet fixed up. And always the problem of not longing for the land of Israel and losing sight of our special mission as Jews. So our rabbis always seem to trace when there is tragedy, when there is suffering, it's going to be one of those two causes. Either we don't love each other enough, or we've lost sight of our mission. Maybe it's really the same thing. So what I'd like to do right now is take us through something which I think is important in the discussion of the Holocaust. And that's the question of who are the real heroes? And what does heroism mean in light of the Holocaust? You know, I know that when I was growing up as a kid, I was always bothered by this question, that how come there wasn't resistance? How come nobody fought back? Or there was very little fighting back? There were some cases, the Warsaw Ghetto, we do know that. But why was there relatively a lack of resistance? Of course, as we get older and we start really studying the episode, we realize the resistance took a totally different form. There was a form in which we're going to speak about today, and I think it was a form that constitutes real resistance. But in order to understand what the resistance was, I think it's first necessary to trace for a moment and ask ourselves, why did God bring such a decree? So I'd like to take you back, first of all, just if you can imagine a case right after the destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is riding on a donkey, and he sees a woman, and he seems to recognize this woman. And he looks at her, and he says, "What's your name?" And she tells him her name. It turns out she is the daughter of the wealthiest man in the Jewish nation. And he looks at her, and he said, "What happened to you?" She now is dressed in all sorts of rags, and she's picking up barley out of the waist of a donkey. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looks at him and says, "You are the wealthiest. You came from the most royal family. And now you're gathering your food from the lowest thing one can imagine, not just from a donkey, the waist of a donkey." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looks at her and he says, "Now I understand." He says, when the Jewish people are doing what's right, no nation can touch us. When the Jewish people loses sight of our mission, we fall in a way that's almost supernatural in its falling. It's not natural to see such a wealthy person stoop to this level. If I could create some sort of sior for you, imagine the wealthiest person we can imagine today in the Jewish people. I don't want to mention a name, but maybe there's a man we know who gives millions of dollars. Imagine that man lost all of his money and had to go so low that he had to gather up barley from the dung of a donkey. Would we look at that and say that's normal? I would say, obviously, there must be something super normal here, supernatural. You know, anybody who takes a quick look at the history of the Holocaust has to start with the rise of a man named Hitler, Yamak Shemo, Adolf Hitler. And if we take a look, this man was a corporal in World War I. He was of no great distinction. He was lazy, in fact. He did get an Iron Cross, having been wounded in World War I. After the war, he ends up in a hospital, having been gassed. He ends up in all sorts of places for poor people. Vienna, he's sleeping on the street. He's a bum. A party is emerging called National Socialism, the Nazi party. He is attracted to it, and he rises up in this party, through a gift of speech, in fact, and becomes the leader of it. From there, his party makes an attempt to try to get a seat in the German parliament. Germany at that time, although despite the depression and despite all the political upheaval caused by World War I, Germany was basically a stable place. They had a very stable president. His name was Hindenburg. And Hitler and his party emerge, and they get 34% of the vote, of the seats in the parliament. It's not enough to do anything. They stage a fire. They claim it's the communists. Within a short period of time, Hindenburg, who was a very rational president, gives Hitler emergency powers and gives him absolute dictatorial control of Germany. By 1935, Hitler is in control. A court system which had been legal and just is now dictatorial. All rights are suspended. Hitler is giving emergency powers. We look at a normal country, a country like Germany, a country like America. Normally the people who rise to power are people who went through the system. They went to Harvard, they went to Yale, they went to the University of Chicago. First they're a congressman, then they're a senator, then maybe they'll become the president. You don't go from the Bowery in the lower part of Manhattan drinking beer on the street to the White House. It doesn't happen. Yet it did happen. A man named Adolf Hitler. And there he was, now with full control of Germany. And his party had an ideology. The ideology was that the Jews are unser Unglück. The Jews are responsible for all of our misfortune. The Jews were responsible for World War I. The Jews were responsible for the Great Depression of 1929, which put millions of people out of work. And he started forming all sorts of laws. These are called the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg law, first law was, it was forbidden by penal servitude, that's to say concentration camp. We weren't in death camps, for a Jew to intermarry. Another law came out in 1935. Jews had to wear Jewish stars pinned to their clothing in the back and the front. 1936, Jews had to change their names. A person could have been in Germany for 1,000 years, and her name might have been Teresa van Hildensprach. She had to change her name to Sarah Teresa van Hildensprach. A man might have been in Germany for 1,000 years. He might have been Count Fritz van Schluppensack. He now has to change his name to Yisrael Count Fritz van Schluppensack. Jewish names. Intermarriage was forbidden. Jewish dress was mandated. And Jewish names were imposed by Hitler. What's interesting about this is, at that time in Germany, there was close to a 65% intermarriage rate. Since the fall of the ghetto in about 1775 or 1787 with the French Revolution, instead of the Jew using the newfound dignity to regain the land of Israel, which is what Dessler said it was there for, the Jew took his newfound freedom to become like the non-Jew. And over a 50-year period, from 1787 to 1933, the Jew basically threw off what it means to be a Jew. A movement began in Germany in the 1840s. One of its leaders made a declaration that we don't need Jerusalem anymore. Berlin is our new Jerusalem. In fact, the Meshech Chochmah commented on that in 1910. And in 1910 he said, because of that statement that Berlin is our new Jerusalem, we're going to see a fire from Jerusalem like we've never seen before. 1910. The Holocaust didn't begin until 1940. But the Jew took this newfound freedom, which was supposed to be used to gain a dignity of what it means to be a Jew and reclaim the land of Israel, Rav Dessler tells us. And instead of reclaiming the land of Israel, we threw off the beautiful mantle of Judaism. And all of a sudden, a man emerges from the sewer and says, Jews, intermarriage is forbidden. 65% intermarriage rate. And he says, guess what? You can't intermarry anymore. Jews, you like to be part of German society so much. The theaters are off limits. The restaurants are off limits. You have to put a star on your clothing to identify you. Jews, you've assimilated and become so much a part of society that we can't tell you apart. Change your names. You're now Sarah again. You're now Yisrael again. And Rav Chanan Wasserman, one of my heroes, who was in England in 1939 when the war broke out, and his students begged him to stay in England. He came back to Lithuania, Poland, because he said the captain doesn't abandon the ship. He was eventually murdered by the Nazis in the Kovno prison in 1944. Rav Elchanan Wasserman writes in his Kovetz, he says, go back to Egypt and understand what happened in Egypt. We know that in Egypt, we were redeemed because of three things. We didn't change our names. We didn't change our clothing. We didn't change our language. Rav Chanan explains the Medrash, and he says it's not like what we think. The way it happened was, as the anti-Semitism in Egypt began to intensify, a rabbi said, wait a minute, what's the cause of the anti-Semitism? It must be that we're becoming more and more like the Egyptian. So the rabbis made a decree. Jews, you have to start wearing Jewish clothing again. It has to be before V'Naki. It has to be modest and as elegant as you can make it. Dignified, because you're dignified. Jews, you have to keep Jewish names. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Forget the Achman and Muchman and Machman. Jews, you got to start speaking the language again. You have to speak Lashon HaKodesh. You got to remember who you are, because if you forget who you are, that's when the anti-Semite comes. And David HaMelech tells us this. David HaMelech in a beautiful Tehillim in Kuf Hey, he praises the Rabbanu Shalom for everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did in taking us out of Mitzrayim. He praises the Mun, and he praises the Kriyas Yamsuf, and he praises all of the Matos. And then right in the middle of the Tehillim, he says, and thank you, Hashem, for increasing the persecution. The Brisker Rav asks the question, what do you mean, thank you, Hashem, for increasing the persecution? Why is that something good? The Brisker Rav says, because what was happening in Mitzrayim was that we wanted to be so much like the Mitzri. So men said the best way to be like the Egyptian is, let me fit in. Let me go to the clubs. Let me go to the sport houses. The only problem is, Brit Milah gets in the way. So apparently the Jews were doing some sort of operation to have Brit Milah, but at the same time make it appear like it was reversed. As soon as we did this, the Brisker Rav said, David HaMelech tells us, all of a sudden they started to hate us. Thank you, Hashem, for the hatred, because it prevented this terrible act of trying to appear to be like the Egyptian. All of a sudden, in 1933, this man comes from the sewer and he takes control and he says, Jews, 65% intermarriage rate. Sorry, concentration camp. Jews, you want to be part of German society? I'm sorry, yellow stars. Jews, you feel so comfortable over here? You have Jewish names, don't forget them. In fact, the Nazis, and one of the first things that they did is they started boycotting Jewish stores. And a Zionist newspaper writes in 1936, a newspaper which had no religious agenda, believe me, writes something very fascinating. He said on one Shabbat in 1936, the German Nazis made a boycott of all Jewish stores, preventing even the Jew from coming into his store. Coincidentally, the synagogues saw the highest attendance that they had seen in over 50 years. And the Zionist newspaper writes, could it be that Hitler has brought the Jew back to Shabbat? You know, one only need listen to the rantings and ravings of Hitler to perhaps understand a little bit of what he was. In an interview with him in 1936, he made the following comment. He said, "The war is between only us and the Jewish people. Everything else is an illusion. The Jews have brought two blemishes on mankind: conscience on the soul and circumcision on the body. He hated us because we have conscience. And he hated us because we have circumcision," which is very interesting, because a nation called Amalek, the first nation to rise against us when we weren't learning Torah properly in the desert, a nation that has haunted us throughout history. Apparently, when they would kill Jews in the desert at Rafidim, apparently they took the Brit Milah and threw it back to God and said to God, "This is yours." Hitler had a hatred for Brit Milah. My question to you, my friends, is what does a thinking Jew say? A thinking Jew living through the time period understands just a little bit. Says 65% intermarriage rate assimilation, comes this nut and is bringing the Jew back to Judaism? Proclaiming that the whole war is over circumcision? What does circumcision represent? It represents the control of the body. It represents the soul over the body. The spirit. It represents about living by a higher ideal, not just by lusts and desires. And here comes this man who says, "I hate the Jew for that." What does a thinking Jew say? Does a thinking Jew say that this is coincidence? Or does a thinking Jew say that there must be a purpose to it? Perhaps a thinking Jew might have been a little bit familiar with the Zohar and might have noticed the following. I don't know much about the Zohar, but I'm going to say something, and if it's incorrect, I'm open to corrections. When the Jew loses sight of his mission, there's a force that God creates in the world that's supposed to bring us back. A darkness takes hold of the world. And from this darkness, we're supposed to discover our inner light. That's one of the jobs of the Satan, to test us, to bring us back. And the particular aspect of the Satan, when he brings the Jew back to the Jew, as it were, in Hebrew is called Sam-El. Sam-El, Samet Mem Aleph Lamed. From now on, I'm going to say Sam-Kel. But the word is Sam-El, so we should know it. It's an aspect of the Satan. And that aspect of the Satan is to bring us back to who we are as Jews. To create a darkness, and from within that darkness, we're supposed to bring it out, the inner light that we know is there. You know, I'm going to do a little gematria for you. Follow me if you can. I think you'll be very intrigued. The gematria of Sam-Kel is Samet Mem Aleph Lamed. It's 131. Keep that number in mind, 131. In 1960, the Israeli Mossad went into Argentina on a very special mission. It was a secret mission. It was a mission that only a few people knew. One of them was the director of the Israeli Intelligence Agency. A group of Mossad agents went into Argentina to capture one of the most notorious Nazi criminals who escaped justice. His name was Adolf Eichmann. A squad of Israeli Mossad agents went into Argentina. They had information that Eichmann, who was Eichmann? Eichmann was the person in charge, basically, of transporting Jews from all over Europe to the concentration camps. One man who had a genius for organization. Probably maybe one of the most significant people in the Nazi structure and the destruction of European Jewry. He escaped justice. He was hiding in Argentina. He heard that he was working in a factory, and this Israeli squad's first task was to identify him. They went in 1960, they identified him. It was him. They looked at pictures, they compared it, they said, we have our man. The second task was to capture him. They arranged a car to block the street where he came out of the factory at the end of the day. Person came back, pretended he was tying a shoelace. As he was doing, he grabbed him, they threw him into the car. They pushed him down in the seat. And the first thing he said to them was, what took you so long? They brought him to a safe house. And now the next task was to get him out of Argentina. In El Al plane, on a special conference, coming into a special international conference, flew into Argentina. The normal stewardesses and stewards were replaced by Mossad agents. They dressed up Eichmann as an El Al captain. They put an intravenous line in his arm so he was drugged. They walked through customs saying he drank too much. They got him onto the El Al plane. As soon as they closed the doors, they were off. Once they were in international airspace, they announced to Israel who they had. Ben Gurion, then the Prime Minister of Israel, went on radio and said that although kidnapping is illegal according to all international law, we have just kidnapped Adolf Eichmann. You'll have to forgive us. They put him on trial in Jerusalem in a glass booth because they were afraid that he would be killed. People gave their testimony, one after another. It became a national catharsis in Israel. People coming forward, telling their experience in the Holocaust. He eventually was convicted, and he was hung by a Yemenite Jew because they did not want to make it look like revenge. It should not be a European Jew. It should be a Yemenite Jew, who happened to be the father of one of my students. One of my students was an Israeli pilot who was second in the Israeli Air Force for shooting out Soviet MiGs. I don't want to mention his name because it's supposed to be confidential. And this was his father, who was the executioner. Why do I mention Eichmann? I mentioned before that the gematria of the Samkel, was 131. The force that God brings in the world to bring darkness so the Jew should express his inner light. Samkel is 131. How interesting it is. That's the exact same gematria as Eichmann. Aleph is 1. Yud is 10. Another Yud is 10, that's 21. Chaf is 20, that's 41. Mem is 40, that's 81. And Nun is 50, 131. The gematria of Eichmann is the same gematria as the Samkel. If you're a Jew in 1939, 1940, 1941, and you have a little of access to the Zohar, do you say coincidence? But it doesn't stop there. The man who controlled Eichmann, his name was Hitler. Hitler. How interesting it is, if we take the Samkel, if we spell it out, Samkel, we know we spell Samach, Mem, Aleph, Lamed. However, another way to do a gematria is to spell out each letter. Samach, Samach, Mem, Chaf, Chaf. Chaf. Excuse me, Mem, Mem, Mem. Chaf. Excuse me, Aleph, Aleph, Lamed, Pei. And finally, Lamed, Lamed, Mem, Dalet. Samchel. Let me spell it for you again. Samchel, Samach, Mem, Chaf. The Mem is Mem, Mem. The Aleph is Aleph, Lamed, Pei. The Lamed is Lamed, Mem, Dalet. course, if we take the first 4 letters, the Samech, the Mem, the Aleph, the Lamed, it's 131. But if we take the remaining letters, the Mem and the Chaf, the Mem, the Lamed, the Pei, the Mem and the Dalet, the value is 254. What's interesting about the number 254? 254 happens to be the same numerical value as Hitler. Hitler, Yimak Shemo. Hey is 5, Yud is 10, Tet is 9, Lamed is 30, Resh is 200, 254. The Samkel, God's agent to bring darkness in the world, to bring out the inner light of the Jew. The outer letters, 131, same as Eichmann. The inner letters, 254, the same as Hitler. How interesting it is also, by the way, if we add 254 and 131 together, it's the number 385, which is the same numerical value as Shekhinah, God's presence. And if we look for more words that have the numerical value of Shekhinah as 385, we'd find the word Anava, which means humility. Perhaps we could say that God brought these forces into the world to create a darkness, but they're from God. God's Shekhinah is there. And it's our job to locate the Shekhinah. How do we locate the Shekhinah? Through Anava, through humility. By going back to who we are. By becoming the Jews who we're supposed to be. So my friends, I tell you this piece of history, and I share with you this little piece of, perhaps we could call it Kabbalah or Gematria. So we should understand that there are no coincidences. Hitler's rise to power was to bring the Jew back to the Shekhinah. It was to bring the Jew back to humility, to bring the Jew to the Jew. The question is, did he succeed? And perhaps, if we decide if he did succeed, we might discover what Jewish heroism really is. You know, I have to say that the Pirkei Avos tells us, what does it mean to be a Gibor? Ezohu Gibor. A Gibor is somebody who is Chovesh es Yitzro. He conquers his desires. It's easy to go after one's desires. It's difficult to conquer them. I'd like to share with you some cases from a very fascinating sefer. It's a sefer written by a Rav Ashroy. Rav Ashroy was the Rav in Kovno, in Lithuania. When the Germans came into Kovno, they destroyed and killed many, many of the Rabbanim. In fact, usually one of the first people they would kill were the rabbis, because they understood the rabbis were the lifeline of Judaism. But he kept Rav Ashroy alive. Why? Because he wanted him to be the curator of the Jewish library, to show as a memorial to the nation he destroyed. So, and from that position, he was able to answer questions. He wrote these questions down, he hid them in tin cans, and he came back to them after the war. I'd like to share some of the questions that were asked to him, and I'd like you to tell me, do we see Jewish heroism? Question number 1. A Jew came to him and asked the following. My son was selected for transport. That's to say, the Germans demand that there be 1,000 Jews on this train, this transport. When the Germans said 1,000, they didn't mean 1,001, they didn't mean 999. They were extremely exacting. He said, I have been able to smuggle a small amount of gold and conceal it. I know one of the Nazi guards, and I know that he will accept a bribe. Am I allowed to use this gold to bribe this Nazi guard in order to rescue my son off this transport? The question turned back to him. and said, if you get your son off that transport, will somebody else go instead? He said, yes. So the Rav said, please don't ask me this question. He said, why? He said, you're asking me to paskin a question of life and death, and to do so a person has to be in a state of health. He said, I'm weak. I'm not in a proper state of mind. I can't decide this. The man pushed him and said, listen, are you telling me that I'm allowed to take my son off this transport or not? He said, please don't ask me this question. So this man said, if you're not telling me it's permitted, it must be that it's forbidden. I will not take my son off of this transport. Later they saw that man smiling. Someone came up to him and said, why are you smiling? Your son was just transported. Most likely to a death camp. He said, Abraham had the test of the Akedas Yitzchak. He was tested to see if he could sacrifice his son for God. But at the last minute, God said, you don't have to do it. I did it. I would not rescue my son for the sake of another Jewish child. How was it? Jews had the opportunity to escape from the ghetto in many different ways. One way was they could disguise themselves as non-Jews. The question came to Rav Ashroy, am I allowed to wear a white collar around my neck and appear to be a priest in order to walk out of the ghetto? The answer was that he could not. And he did not. Another man came to Rav Ashroy and asked him, I have a forged German passport. There's only one problem. It says my religion. And the words, the letters, RC are written there, which stand for Roman Catholic. Am I allowed to present this document to the guard at the gate in order to escape? Rav Ashroy thought, and he said, RC. It doesn't directly say that you're a Roman Catholic, it's just a symbol, it's a hint. He said, you should have in mind that it means something else. Yes, you can use it. Another case came to Rav Ashroy. They were able to smuggle a cow into the ghetto. And they had people who could do shchita, they could shecht it correctly. They only had one problem. They didn't have salt. And we know that one of the halachot are we have to remove the blood. To remove the blood we need salt. So how can we eat the animal if we don't have salt? So they had an idea. They said we can roast the animal. If you roast the animal, open an open fire that draws out the blood, and therefore one does not need to salt it like we do with liver. But they had a problem. The problem was that the stomachs of so many Jews had shrunk, that they wouldn't be able to digest roasted meat. They needed boiled meat. So Rav Ashroy gave them a suggestion. Cook the meat in water, and when you cook it, always make sure that you have 60 times more water than meat. And as a result, any blood that's in the meat will be nullified. Batal l'shisha. So the boys, they took their time to cook this meat. Slowly, slowly, slowly. In order that it should always be 60 times more water than meat. A Jew came to Rav Ashroy and he said that we're working in an airfield for the Germans right now. We're on starvation rations. They're offering us non-kosher food to eat. We're not yet starving. But at the rate we're going, if we don't eat the food now, we will starve next week. Can we eat the food now? And Rav Ashroy paskined, yes. Future starvation does permit taking precautions now. And the case came before Rav Ashroy. The Germans are giving out, they call these cards work permits. Do we have a right to determine whom we give this card to? Because by giving to one card, you're taking the life away from somebody else. And Rav Ashroy said, at this juncture, you do. What fascinates me by these questions, my friends, is that Jews weren't just trying to live. It wasn't just a case or a question of staying alive. It was, how do we stay alive as Jews? You know, I had a Rabbi who used to tell us, when he used to give us a test, he used to say that, I don't call my tests bichinot. In Hebrew, the word bichinah means examination. I call my tests nisyonot. Because a nisayon is a test, but it's a different type of test. It's a test that raises you up. He said, my tests are for the purpose of making you better. God squeezes us, and He tests us. But it's all for the purpose of bringing out something that we have within. If God brought from the source Adolf Hitler and Adolf Eichmann to bring the Jew back to his real self, which self did He want to bring him back to? The Jew who was able to ask such questions and to live a life of purity in the most difficult situations. You know, Rabbi Akiva, who we read about this morning in Azkar Lebanon, as he was being executed by the Romans, as they were raking off the flesh from his skin, he started to mitzachik, he started to smile. As his Talmidim looked at him, and he said, Ad kan? Even now? And Rabbi Akiva said, my whole life I've said the words, V'ahavta es Hashem Elochecha, B'chol levavecha, B'chol nafshecha. Hashem, I love you. I love you with all my heart. I love you with all of my nefesh. What does that mean? It means even if God's going to take my body away, I love you. My whole life I've always wanted to see if I could love you. Even while you're taking my body away. Now that you're taking my body away, I shouldn't smile. You're testing me with the ultimate love. I can love you even now. There was a Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto, kept a diary. In 1945, the Germans destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto. There were a group of about 700 fighters, most of them not older than 22. It was a revolt of young people. And this one young person was in a bunker which poisonous gas had been passed down to the sewer line in order to kill everyone who had remained. As the poisonous gas was coming towards him, he wrote the following words in his diary. He said, Almighty, I have one bullet left in my revolver. I know that suicide is forbidden. However, if one's death is imminent, I know that one is allowed to take one's life in order to avoid horrendous pain. However, I choose not to take my life. I want to use the last few moments before the gas comes to my lungs, in order to show you, God, that you lost. If you were testing me to see if I could still love you, even under these situations, if you think I'm going to give up my faith, turn my back away from you, you think I'm going to forget it all, if you think you could take away my love, then you lost. Because I still love you, and I'm going to use these last few moments to realize how much I love you. His diary survived the war. He did not. My friends, the message of Tisha BAv is a message that implores us to look at the tragedy and suffering that we as a people have experienced for 2,500 years. God's purpose, as His purpose was in the Holocaust, was always one purpose: to bring us back to who we're supposed to be. To bring out the hero that lies within. The hero doesn't mean someone who can fight with a gun or a machine gun. A hero is someone who is Kovesh as Yitzro, who conquers himself. As Mike Tress points out in his visit to the DP camp in 1946, he saw a Jew with a long beard. And he looked at that Jew and he said, "My brother, how do you have such a beard? Either the Nazis would shave them off, or we had to shave them off to hide." And this Jew said, "I was a partisan." A partisan. Mike Tress looked at him and said, "You fought in the forest with a machine gun, with grenades?" He said, "No." "But you had rifles?" "No." "What do you mean you were a partisan?" He said, "My friend, some people are a partisan with a machine gun. I was a partisan with my beard. No matter where I went, no matter where I hid, I would not shave my beard. They can take my body, but they can't take my spirit." Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech olam, shelo asani aved. We're not slaves, we're free. Freedom means that I can conquer and live the way I'm supposed to live in any situation. We look forward to the end of Tisha BAv. We look forward to the end of all Tisha BAvs. We look forward to the return of the Jewish people to Zion. We look forward to the coming of the Mashiach, yet our rabbis tell us that the Mashiach can come in two ways. One way is because it's so bad. And if you look outside on the streets, it's bad. It's really bad. You look at America. There was a 65% intermarriage rate in Germany. What's it in America? It's close to that. For every Jew who's learning Torah and keeping Shabbat, how many tens or hundreds have no idea what Shabbos is? What Torah is. It's really bad. Our rabbis tell us something very fascinating. They say that when Mashiach comes, more importantly than how bad it is the effort that individual Jews show to stick up for God. And I'll tell you something. In a world that's so distant, the fact that there are people like you who care, it means you're fighting against the odds. You're fighting against all the forces of the world that want to keep you down. Our rabbis tell us, no matter how bad it is, as long as there are individual Jews who have the strength and the courage to stand up, that's worth more than everything else. So I'm extremely confident that in the merit of all of you, in the heroism that all of you show, the heroism to do what's right in a world that tells you not to keep Shabbat, to keep Kashrut, to learn Torah, to dress b'tzniut. Everything you're doing, you're heroes. And that's the type of heroism that God says is a heroism that will bring the Mashiach. So I am confident that we will see the Mashiach. Return to Kol HaYisrael and see him in Rabbi. Amen.